who lost family members and other loved ones in this terrible tragedy. Their sufferings beyond imagining. Our thoughts too go out to all those who lost their homes and possessions in the fire. Since that terrible event on the 14th of June, a month ago, we've all been deeply affected by this unprecedented tragedy, and words feel inadequate. I'd like to pay tribute to the men and women of our emergency services, many of whom risked life and limb in their efforts to tackle the fire and showed extraordinary courage in their determination to save lives, and also, equally importantly, to the many volunteers and charities who've given their time and much, much more to help the bereaved and those who have lost their homes. Let me turn to the purpose of the debate. Sir Martin Moore-Bick, the chair of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry, is currently consulting over the scope of the inquiry's terms of reference. So this debate provides an opportunity for Parliament to express its views about the inquiry before the terms of reference are set. Of course, it's most important that the chair listens to the views of those most affected by the tragedy and takes account of those views when considering the scope of his inquiry's terms of reference. But I'm sure that Sir Martin will want to reflect on the views expressed in this House today. And of course, we should all be conscious that the survivors of the terrible tragedy will also be listening to what's said in this House today. Oh, yes, of course.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way at such an early point in his remarks. But does he agree with me that it will be important to have an interim report? Because if there are recommendations which affect crucial safety issues with high-rise blocks, then clearly that needs to be attended to as soon as possible.
My right honourable friend is of course correct, and indeed he may be aware that there is an intention to produce an interim report as soon as is practical, because I'm conscious that one of the great wishes of many of the survivors and the groups representing them is of as quick a resolution as possible, an answer to as many of the questions as possible. Yes, sure.
I thank the First Secretary for giving way. Just on the scope of the report, I'm sure we'll get lots of comments on this through the course of the debate, and I don't want to widen it too far, but can he assure the House that the scope will also look at private blocks and not just be confined to social housing? Because in my experience as a city centre MP, it's often much more difficult for residents to have their voice heard when you have opaque ownership and managing agents who are not responsive to residents in the private blocks rather than the social blocks.
The honourable lady makes a good point. I can't guarantee her what the terms of reference will be, because obviously that's a matter for Sir Martin. But as I say, one of the purposes of this debate is for views like that precisely to be expressed. And on the issue of private blocks, I'm happy to assure her and the House that the testing regime for the safety of blocks does extend to private blocks as well. Did the honourable gentleman want to intervene?
Will the Secretary say what's happened to the Independent Recovery Task Force that was announced about a week ago by his colleague? If it hasn't yet been convened, if we don't know who the members are or what they're doing or whether they've been to Kensington, would he reconsider sending in commissioners, particularly given what we heard this morning, which is the person that task force are reporting to, i.e. the new leader of Kensington Council, who, despite being a councillor for 11 years, has not been inside a tower block, despite being a cabinet member for 5 years, has not seen fit to go into any of the tower blocks in her borough?
Well, I first of all can reassure the honourable gentleman that the task force will be reporting to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, and not to Kensington Council. So I hope I provides him with reassurance. It's an independent body reporting to the Secretary of State.
Pursuant to that point, could the Secretary of State just clarify for us whether the Recovery Task Force has any executive authority whatsoever, or is it purely advisory?
Yeah, it's an advisory, not an executive panel reporting to the Secretary of State, which I think is obviously the proper way to proceed. In her statement announcing the inquiry, the Prime Minister, can I make some progress? I've given away. Well, okay.
I think it's very very important, that. So we're saying this task force, then, has no executive authority, and the executive authority remains with the council. So is that a distinction between the task force powers and the powers that would be available to a commissioner if a commissioner was appointed?
Well, the task force will be overseeing what the council does, but as I've said to his honourable friends, it will be reporting to the Secretary of State, who of course can then decide the appropriate way to proceed. So it's independent of the council, it's not reporting to the council, and it will oversee what the council is doing. The Prime Minister identified rightly the immediate priority when she announced the inquiry as establishing the facts of what happened at Grenfell Tower in order to take the necessary action to prevent a similar tragedy from happening again. The inquiry will fulfil that purpose. It will report in 2 phases with, as I've already said, an interim report being published as quickly as possible. But beyond that immediate focus, it's also important that all the wider lessons from both this catastrophe and the inspections of other buildings around the country that followed it are identified and learnt. Sir Martin has said, and I quote, can I finish Sir Martin's quote first? I should make it clear that I shall want to consider a broad range of evidence, including on the role of the relevant public authorities and contractors, in order to help me answer the important questions. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm grateful too to the Housing Minister for answering my written question on the privatisation of housing functions in Kensington and Chelsea Council. I find it extraordinary that there is no central management, not even any records kept of housing contracts within the Housing Department. We now have a situation where there is no accountability and no transparency of the nature of local authority contracts with the private sector involving housing and the degree to which housing contracts are then subcontracted to other private providers. In view of this tragedy, would the government advise whether there are plans to revisit this policy?
Well, clearly there are a large range of issues on which the inquiry may well wish to make recommendations to the government, and the Honourable Lady has put that thought on the record now, and as I've said previously, Sir Martin, I imagine, will wish to take note of what views are expressed during this debate.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. On the wider point, he will appreciate that many of the survivors suffered from carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, of course, carbon monoxide is known as the silent killer. And will he ensure that amongst the many other lessons that are learned, the planned and proposed review of carbon monoxide alarms does actually go ahead in October of this year?
Yeah. Well, as my honourable friend makes an extremely good point of the, not least the wider point about the range of lessons that need to be learnt from this terrible tragedy, and as he will know, there's an expert panel that will be helping the inquiry that will have a range of skills and expertise across a number of areas, and again he's given rise to an important issue which not just government but the inquiry itself will want to look at. As the inquiries...
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. He's right that no stone should be left unturned in uncovering the truth behind the horror that was the Grenfell Tower Fire. But when we talk about wider lessons and action in the meantime, can I ask him this question? Birmingham has 231 tower blocks. The City Council has rightly decided that it will retrofit sprinklers in all of those blocks. That will cost £31 million in a council that suffered £700 million of cuts to their budget. Will the government unequivocally commit to funding all necessary safety measures pending the outcome of the inquiry?
The safety measures that are recommended by the Fire Service, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Communities, has said will be met by the government. So those are the necessary measures that the Fire Service recommends. The inquiry is designed to ascertain the causes of the tragedy and ensure...
For clarity, I believe that the Minister has just made a very important statement. Is he saying that the necessary safety measures to protect what are 10,000 households in 231 blocks will be funded by the government?
I mean, for clarity, let me go all the way through this, that the if the fire service recommends that something needs to be done for safety reasons, and if the local authority, I mean, obviously they will go to the local authority, and the local authority will be the first port of call to pay for that, and I'm sure all local authorities will want to follow the fire service's recommendations on this. If the local authority can show that it can't afford it, then obviously central government will step in. But that's a matter for local authorities and for the fire service in the first instance, which clearly is the sensible way to proceed. The inquiry will clearly need to examine all relevant circumstances. I think I've been very generous in giving way. I really need to make some progress now. The inquiry will need to examine all relevant circumstances leading up to and surrounding the fire at Grenfell Tower, its spread to the whole of the building, and its effect on residents. That necessarily means looking at circumstances well beyond the design, construction and modification of the building itself. It will mean looking at the role of relevant public authorities and contractors and the broader implications of the fire for the adequacy and enforcement of relevant regulations. It will also mean looking at the handling of concerns previously expressed by local residents. Sir Martin is highly respected. Can I make some progress? And then I'll give way. I'm conscious that there are many people who want to contribute to this debate. I've been extremely generous in giving way in the opening remarks, and I do think the House will benefit from making progress. Sir Martin is highly respected, and as a recently retired Court of Appeal judge, he brings with him many years of judicial experience. Sir Martin and the government fully agree that for this inquiry, consulting on the terms of reference is an important way of involving those affected by the tragedy. It's clearly right that those affected by this terrible tragedy and others with an interest are given the opportunity to shape the terms of reference, which will in turn give direction and focus to the inquiry. Sir Martin has started that consultation process and is keen to give as many people as possible the chance to contribute to the consultation. He'll consider all suggestions made to him when drawing up the terms of reference. He will then make a recommendation to the Prime Minister, who under the Inquiries Act is responsible for setting out the terms of reference. Can I do so in a second? I will give way again, but I wish to finish this section, if I may, first. Because Sir Martin said, and I'm going to quote him at length here, because this, I think, is at the heart of many of the issues that have arisen. He said, "I'm determined to establish the causes of the tragedy and ensure that the appropriate lessons are learnt. To do this, the inquiry will need to examine all relevant circumstances leading up to and surrounding the fire at Grenfell Tower in order to understand its causes and prevent such a tragedy ever happening again. To produce a report as quickly as possible with clear recommendations for action, I will listen to people and consider a broad range of evidence, including on the role of the relevant public authorities and contractors, in order to help me answer the important questions. I therefore want to hear from people directly affected by the fire and others involved to listen to their views on the shape of the inquiry's work and the questions we should be seeking to answer. This is clearly the right approach to take. Sir Martin has set a deadline for comments of Friday the 28th of July, extended by 2 weeks from the inquiry's original deadline, following discussions between Sir Martin and survivors of the fire and other residents of the estate, which made clear that those affected need more time to respond to the consultation. This extension will allow the inquiry to begin its work in August. I'm sure we're all agreed the sooner the inquiry can begin its work, the sooner we will have the important conclusions of its interim report. It's important to point out that the public and others with an interest will of course be able to feed into the inquiry throughout the course of the inquiry's work by writing to the inquiry or emailing the contact address provided on the inquiry website. And I'll give way in a second. And the terms of reference can always be revised during the course of the inquiry. And this may be likely as the inquiry reflects on what it has learned at the interim report stage before it begins phase 2 of its work. I will give way to
my right honourable friends for giving way, and I'm heartened to hear about the inclusivity of this inquiry, and public safety must be at the forefront. So would my right honourable friend comment on whether he might look back historically, and can he confirm whether the inquiry will look into the effectiveness of the fire regulations and the enforcement regime that was introduced in 2005 and 6 respectively?
Well, my honourable friend raises a valid and important point. And I'm able to assure that the expert panel which, as I say, covers a range of different expertise, is already looking at that, and that will feed into the inquiry. The honourable gentleman wishes me to give way.
Mr. Speaker, following on exactly from the question from his honourable friend, the building regulations should be due for review because in this country it's usually 10 years, it's now 11. The Lacono House inquiry recommended in 2013 the building regulation should be reviewed. The government has been saying since 2011 and after Lacono House they would be done by this year. We do not have to wait for a public inquiry to say the building regulations should be reviewed. When can we expect the working party to be recalled to show that that work is underway now?
Well, I appreciate the honourable gentleman has huge experience and expertise in this particular area, and I can assure him that one of the things the expert panel is doing is seeing if there is any advice that needs to be given very urgently to the Secretary of State, which needs to be acted on. So that's one of the things the expert panel is doing.
Secretary of State giving way. He's right that there should be this consultation on the remit to try to help rebuild trust of the local community in the inquiry. But is he prepared to go further? Should there not be an advisory panel that has genuine community members that are diverse and are from the community to advise the panel?
The right honourable gentleman may know that there is already, if you like, something similar to what he suggested, a group called Grenfell United, which has brought together many of the groups, which indeed my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, and the Minister met last night for a long and extensive meeting. So I can assure him that the views of those most affected are obviously being fed in to Sir Martin directly, but they also are having direct communication with the Secretary of State as well. In terms of the potential appointment of panel members, the priority at this stage is for consultation on the terms of reference, which once agreed will allow the inquiry to start work. The Chair will then want to consider what other expert assistance might be required and how that should be provided to the inquiry, including the process of consultation. But I want to assure the House that government work is already in hand to address issues highlighted by this terrible tragedy. DCLG and the Cabinet Office are working together across the piece and the wider building safety programme, which I know honourable members on all sides have been concerned about. DCLG has written to local councils and housing associations calling for checks to social housing. A survey of the public sector estate began on the 28th of June with a request both for government departments and arm's-length bodies to review all public buildings in line with provided guidance and to submit samples for testing from priority buildings with aluminium composite material cladding. The Cabinet Office.
Thank you very much indeed for giving way. I would like to ask the First Secretary if he's aware that a lot of the advice actually from DCLG has been quite contradictory. So we appeared initially to be informed that certain kinds of cladding had to be removed. That then seemed to change to a position where certain kinds of cladding could still be safe as part of fire-safe systems. We then, after that, also had a lack of clarity about whether that testing regime was compulsory, which appeared to be the initial position. Now we've been informed that actually the department was responding to landlords' concerns. Is the First Secretary aware that this kind of flip-flopping is causing a lot of confusion and concern, including to tenants?
The expert panel, which I've mentioned on a number of occasions, who are precisely the people to provide the advice, are continuing to provide advice. Their advice has been consistently followed by the department because clearly they have the expertise to do so. So as they may well discover more and decide that advice needs to change, but it is all done on the basis of experts in fire safety who are independent of government. That one first, you first.
I'm grateful for the First Secretary giving way. As somebody who grew up in a two-bed council block of flats, the traditional advice was always to stay put and await rescue. Right. I wonder how many souls perished following the traditional advice that tenants took, and is that advice changing?
That is clearly an issue that may well be addressed by Sir Martin in the public inquiry. That's clearly the appropriate forum for that sort of investigation to be made. Give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm grateful to the First Secretary. Even as we speak, even before this inquiry has begun, there continue to be new tower blocks being constructed and developed in my constituency and around the country. Can the First Secretary say what new advice has been issued both to planning authorities and those who monitor construction standards and to the building industry?
The expert panel has published new advice, which was published last week, which with a memorandum of understanding about what should be done about new blocks. So that issue has very directly been addressed since over the past month. Returning to the issues, one more.
I thank you for giving way. Just in relation to the points that have just been raised, I have constituents who, people with disabilities who live on higher floors in tower blocks who have raised great concerns about what they should do in the event of an emergency, where they have been given sometimes conflicting advice about whether people in wheelchairs should be, for example, be getting lifts and using lifts, which I think goes contrary to advice. So would he encourage issues to do with people with disabilities on higher floors also be part of some of the extended inquiry work?
Yeah, I mean, there are, as she will know, already rules in place to cover precisely that type of thing. And obviously, the best advice is that those rules should be obeyed. The fire safety advisors are obviously looking at what happened and what should happen in future, but it will be the local fire safety authorities that give that advice. And I'm sure that all of them will have been looking very carefully at the advice they've been given, particularly to, as she says, people who are in wheelchairs and so on, who clearly will be very understandably concerned at whether they're getting the right safety advice. So I would advise her to talk to her local fire safety officials. If I can return to the actions that have been taken over the past month, the Cabinet Office has established a cross-government working group, the Public Estates Response Group, with a technical subgroup to ensure that all technical advice is understood and is being properly applied. Government is ensuring full engagement and alignment with activity in the devolved administrations, because I'm conscious that they will be particularly concerned about this as well. DCLG has, as I said, formed an expert advisory panel made up of a ranging of building and fire safety experts to advise government on any immediate action required to ensure buildings are safe. And the Cabinet Office is working with DCLG's expert panel and others to establish a remediation plan and next steps towards the review of building regulations that several honourable members have asked for. All of this work is underway outside the inquiry's timetable, so its completion won't be dependent on publication of the inquiry's report. I know that some of those affected by this terrible event are concerned that an inquest would be more appropriate than an inquiry, and that the inquiry might delay identification of those who died. I can reassure them that there will be an inquest. The coroner, Dr. Fiona Wilcox, is already investigating the deaths. This is a statutory duty. Once the identification of each of the deceased has been completed, I understand that the coroner will open the inquest into each individual death and then adjourn proceedings pending the outcome of other investigations, including the inquiry. The coroner will consider the inquiry's recommendations to determine whether to resume the inquests. Therefore, this process won't delay the formal identification of victims. And I should also reassure those who want a criminal investigation into this terrible tragedy that this is in hand. The Metropolitan Police announced the investigation on the 16th of June. It's one of the largest and most complex investigations ever undertaken by the Metropolitan Police, with around 250 specialist investigators currently engaged. I hope that honourable members will be reassured by the clear statements about the investigation from the Metropolitan Police. Detective Superintendent Fiona McCormack said on the 23rd of June that the investigation would identify and investigate any criminal offence. And of course, given the deaths of so many people, we are considering manslaughter as well as criminal offences and breaches of legislation and regulations. a point reinforced on Monday by Assistant Commissioner Martin Hewitt, who said, "The investigation we are conducting is a criminal investigation that quite obviously is starting from the potential that there was something that effectively amounts to the manslaughter of those people." It's clear that this will be a rigorous, detailed investigation. The police are determined that if wrongdoing has occurred, the perpetrators will be brought to justice. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Grenfell Tower Inquiry's task is of the utmost importance to establish the facts and make recommendations about the action needed to prevent a similar tragedy happening again. The Government will provide the inquiry with all the resources it needs to complete its work thoroughly and rapidly. This was a terrible tragedy. We must learn the lessons to ensure nothing like it can happen again.
The question is that this House has considered the Grenfell Tower Fire inquiry. John Healey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today is 4 weeks to the day since the truly dreadful Grenfell Tower Fire, the worst fire and greatest loss of life in this country, at least since the London Blitz. 158 families have lost their homes, many others have lost loved ones, and all are struggling with the horror and the trauma of losing family members, of their own escape, and of being left with absolutely nothing. And this is the time when they should feel they can look to their council and their government for help, as well as to the overwhelming solidarity and support of their local community. But so many don't, and so many feel they simply can't trust those in authority to listen to them and to do what they promise. So this is a very strong message to ministers, to Kensington and Chelsea Council, and to the chair of the Prime Minister's public inquiry. Madam Deputy Speaker, today is 1 week on from the Prime Minister's deadline for everyone affected to be found a home nearby, yet just 4 of the 158 families from Grenfell Tower have moved into a fresh home, and this is only temporary. Today is 24 days on from the start of the government's testing programme, when the Prime Minister said we can test over 100 buildings a day, yet only 224 tests have been done, almost all on one type of filler in one type of cladding. Today is 4 years and 4 months on since 2 official coroner's reports following other fatal tower block fires, yet the government is still failed to act on their recommendations. And today is almost 3 weeks since the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "We simply haven't given enough attention to social housing," and yet, in her speech yesterday, crying out for ideas, any ideas for a domestic policy programme, there was no mention of housing and no mention of the words social housing. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the measure of the government's response to the Grenfell Tower tragedy. Too slow to act, too slow to grasp the gravity and the complexity of the problems, one step off the pace at every stage. So let me spell out to the First Minister and his colleagues. This is the pledge that this party makes, as the official opposition, above all to the survivors and the relatives of the families from Grenfell Tower. We will not rest until all those who need help and a new home have it. We will not rest until all those culpable have been brought fully to account. And we will not rest until all measures needed to make sure this can never ever happen again are fully in place. Now, we welcome the Prime Minister's public inquiry. We welcome what the First Minister said this afternoon about this debate, helping to inform the terms of reference and the way the inquiry will be conducted. We will make a submission to the Prime Minister on the terms of reference, and we will recommend an approach like the Macpherson inquiry, with panel members appointed with a deep experience in community relations to help overcome this serious gulf in trust that many in the North Kensington community feel. Let me turn to housing and the help for the survivors. The pledges the government have made to the families and the survivors: no strings financial assistance, open access to trauma counselling, guaranteed school places, no legal action on immigration status or subletting, and rehousing, are all welcome and all important. But there's still a big gap between what ministers are saying to us in this House and what the residents and community in North Kensington are saying is happening to them. On housing, how is it 1 week after the Prime Minister's deadline that only 4 families have moved into a fresh home and 13 others have been offered somewhere they feel they can say yes to? Who is, let me finish this point, of course I'll give way, who is finding, checking and offering this temporary accommodation? Who's providing the reassurance needed for the families? Who is in charge? I give way.
I thank him for giving way. And he's making a good point. And of course, these people and their homes and rehousing them is of the utmost importance. But to politicise about the figures and to argue, I don't know where the honourable member is getting his figures from, but I was led to believe that 139 people had received offers of accommodation, and many families have agreed not yet to engage because they're not quite ready, so we can't force them to either. So I'm not sure where the statistics are coming from, or whether this scaremongering about statistics is actually helping solve the actual problem that this government is getting on with doing.
Well, the First Secretary's speech to this House was actually fact and figure free. And if I'm wrong about the fact that only 4 of these families, after nearly 1 month, have actually moved into a fresh home, a temporary home, the rest are still in hotels, then he can get up and he can correct me. But he isn't. And as far as the Honourable Lady says, scaremongering and political point scoring, it is precisely the decisions and policies of those in power that the Grenfell Tower residents want challenged. And it is precisely the questions of policy, of ideology, of responsibility in government that lie at the heart of the deep changes needed to fix the housing crisis in this country, and her own Prime Minister has recognised that. I give way to the First Secretary.
Just to clear up any confusion there is in the Honourable Gentleman's mind, 159 families have been offered. As my honourable friend said, rightly, some of those have said, and I heard the Leader of Kensington Council say this morning, some of those have said that they don't wish yet to make the move into the housing they've been offered. Of course, everyone across the House will recognise that we need to meet those wishes. They have to decide how they can try and cope with this. But I can assure him and the House that 159 of the families identified have been offered, some of them have been offered more than one accommodation. That commitment has been met.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think the Secretary of State may want to set the record entirely straight when he winds up this debate. I'd take the First Secretary's at his word for now. But last week we were told there were 158 families who lost their homes in the Grenfell Tower, that 139 had been offered accommodation by the Prime Minister's deadline. Last week only 3 had moved out. This week, today, 4 weeks on, 4 have moved out, and only a further 13 have actually been given offers that they feel they can accept. There is a huge gap between what ministers are saying here and what residents are saying there. That is the problem, and the question to the First Secretary and the Secretary of State: who is sorting this out? Who's in charge? Who's responsible for this continuing failure to provide the homes and the start again that people need? Because I'm sure he would accept a hotel room is no home, and temporary accommodation is no place to try to rebuild a shattered life. So the top and the urgent priority must be for ministers to find the permanent homes that are needed. Now, we welcome the 68 homes in Kensington Row that now will be available as social housing for the residents of Grenfell Tower. The rest, I'll just finish this point and then I'll give way. The rest could be done straightforwardly by doing a deal with local housing associations to make new homes available, by leasing or buying vacant private properties in the area, and by funding the council to build or acquire the new homes needed. They might even force Kensington and Chelsea to use some of its reported £274 million in reserves to take this urgent priority action. I give way to my honourable friend.
Most of the residents who've been decanted are in budget hotels. I know because I visited a number who were unceremoniously dumped in my borough by Kensington and Chelsea without money or change of clothes or anything of that kind, and have been there for 4 weeks. None of those people, Mr. Speaker, are there because they want to be there. They're there because they haven't been made appropriate offers. So when my honourable friend agree with me, we should stop hearing this sophistry from the other side about this, and they should get on with offering decent, permanent homes to people who've suffered extraordinary trauma.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I entirely agree with my honourable friend, and he speaks from a very special authority as a neighbouring MP who has spent a great deal of the last 4 weeks in the North Kensington community, working alongside our honourable friend, the new member for Kensington, to try and support and give voice to the concerns of residents and survivors. Let me move on to safety testing. It is totally unacceptable, 4 weeks on from the Grenfell Tower Fire, that ministers still don't know and can't say how many of the country's other tower blocks are unsafe. And the government's testing programme is too slow, it's too narrow, it's too confused. This is a testing programme in chaos. Only 224 tests done when an estimated 530 tower blocks have the same cladding. A total of 4,000 tower blocks across the country. This means 24 days after the start of this testing programme, which we could told could test 100 buildings a day, we find tests have been done on only half the highest risk blocks and fewer than 1 in 20 of the total number of tower blocks around the country. Of course, we did well.
Last week, the Secretary of State said that there was no backlog in testing and that tests would be processed within a matter of hours. Given the continuing shortfall in the number of high-rise buildings that have been subject to testing, does he share my absolute bafflement that the government doesn't appear to know where any of this material actually is?
Yes, I share your bafflement. I share it entirely, and I also hear stories of councils and housing associations that want to test their buildings, may not have the same type of cladding, and they simply can't get the tests. And I notice again, the First Secretary's speech and his update to this House was entirely free of any facts or any figures that can update us on the chaos of this testing programme. I give way.
My honourable friend for giving way. My honourable friend will be aware that in my constituency, Camden Council has done the testing and as a result has evacuated over 3,000 people from the Chalcots estate. Camden Council is spending its own money trying to make sure that these buildings are fit for purpose before the residents are placed in it again. Does my honourable friend agree that the government should be giving financial support to Camden Council and other such councils after cutting their budget for years on end?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is that I pay tribute to the quite tough decision that Camden Council had to make in those circumstances. My fear is that other housing associations, other councils, landlords of high-rise blocks around the country will hold back or potentially cut corners because they know they cannot afford to do the works required, either to remove and replace cladding or to make the inside safe and fully fire safety compliant, and that they will do so only because they cannot get a straight answer from this government, a clear commitment to upfront funding where it's needed to make sure this essential work is done. This leaves hundreds of thousands of residents in tower blocks around the country uncertain still uncertain still whether or not their blocks are safe. And I say to the ministers opposite, I hope they stay for this debate. They will hear from a number of colleagues around the country concerns about the testing system, that it leaves landlords and it leaves residents confused. It's a testing system that isn't meeting the needs of those residents or of those landlords. And we know from the Lacanau house fire that cladding is not the whole problem, nor, I suspect, was it in Grenfell. Yet only one component of one type of cladding has been tested until very recently. No tests on cladding systems, on insulation materials, on the interaction between cladding and insulation, or on the installation and fire breaks between floors. And I say to the First Secretary and the Secretary of State, housing associations across the country, like Bradford, based in communities, can't get their type of cladding tested. So they can't reassure their residents their tower blocks are safe. While councils, like Salford, have stopped stripping off cladding from their high-rise flats because they've got no guidance from government on what to replace it with. Now, I will indeed.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and I want to just make a comment on that point in relation to Hounslow Council, who I would like to commend for the speed with which they were able to declad a block in my constituency, but who have hit some of these concerns about what they will be replacing that cladding with, but also my concern that with the amount of recladding that may take place across the country, that we don't see those who may be producing that cladding jacking up the prices and making it even more expensive to replace.
Well, my honourable friend is right. Her council, like Oxford Council, for instance, at the moment is in the dark. It simply doesn't know what the guidance and advice from government is going to be, and if they take the cladding off, what do they replace it with that they can be certain is safe. Now, ministers have the panel of independent experts. The First Secretary made great play of this, rightly, in his speech. The panel there to advise them on the urgent lessons and action necessary. This is very welcome, and I hope that this panel can help the government get back on track. I hope it can deal with some of the following concerns which ministers will hear from colleagues from other parts of the country. What advice will the government give to landlords, and what reassurance to residents, if cladding systems pass the new second round of tests when they may have failed the narrow first test? If cladding fails the government's tests, must it be taken off tower blocks in all circumstances? And will the government cover the costs of taking it down and replacing it? When will councils and housing associations be able to get other cladding or insulation tested? How will the government make sure all internal fire safety works are now being done inside tower blocks meet the highest safety standards? And will the government launch an immediate review into the approved inspectors responsible for building control checks? Who hires them? Who pays them? Who approves their qualifications, starting with all those responsible for signing off the systems being failed by the government's tests? So 4 weeks on, ministers must widen their testing programme, reassure all high-rise tenants that their buildings are safe, or commit to fund the urgent work necessary to make them safe. Now, the clearest warnings that the system of fire safety checks and building controls was failing came more than 4 years ago, following the inquests into fatal tower block fires at Lacanau House and Shirley Towers. Both coroners wrote formal Rule 43 letters to ministers with recommendations to improve fire safety in high-rise buildings. Now, these Rule 43 letters, Madam Deputy Speaker, are only done by coroners when government can prevent further loss of life. That's their importance. Some of the recommendations were simply rejected, like making internal cable supports fire resistant, or on-site information about a tower block available for firefighters arriving to fight a blaze. Ministers said they would act on others, but simply haven't. With retrofitting sprinkler systems, the government passed all responsibility onto landlords, And one minister even said in 2014, and I quote, "We believe that it is the responsibility of the fire industry rather than government." And with overhauling building regulations, the government promised a review, but this didn't happen. And now the housing minister has just told me, and I quote, "This work will now need to be informed by any recommendations that the independent inquiry into Grenfell Tower Fire makes." Can I just finish this point here, because it's important. Rather than waiting months or years longer to start this work, ministers must put this right now, act now, start installing sprinkler systems in the highest risk high-rise blocks, and start the overhaul of building regulations which can incorporate any findings from the fire investigations or from the public inquiry. I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you. Does my right honourable friend, has he picked up the same rumour that I've picked up on the review of the building regulations that went on in CLG? And I've heard that it was paused because there weren't the civil servants able to lead on that work because they were taken off that work because of Brexit and work that needed to be done to look at Brexit. And if that's true, how many other pieces of work that are essential and urgent and safety related are on pause in government right now?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hadn't heard that rumour. I prefer to deal with the facts in front of us. But I have to say, my honourable friend is dead right. There is a serious question of capacity in the Communities and Local Government Department, and there is an even greater question over leadership as well, which I will come on to in a moment. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to turn to the fundamental issues, as the Prime Minister described them, that were raised by the Grenfell Tower fire. Because when a country as decent and well off as ours fails to provide something as basic as a safe home for all its citizens, then things must change. Two areas to start with. First, on regulation. Surely all sides of the House would agree this, that all markets, all consumers, all organisations require regulation. Require regulation to guarantee quality or safety, to ensure fair practices and to stop abuse. Yet this is not the mindset of the current government. Never again can we have a government minister challenged on fire safety measures, as one was after the Camberwell fire, saying it is not the government's responsibility, and justifying this with the government's approach to regulations, 1 in, 2 out rule. And if the Prime Minister and First Secretary are serious about change, then they should start by confirming that this approach has ended with the Cameron-Osborne era of Conservative government. I will.
Making a very important point. He in the House might like to know, when I was a junior business minister, I was asked by people from Number 10, the Cabinet Office, whether we should get rid of the fire safety regulations with respect to girls' and ladies' night dresses, whether we should get rid of the fire regulations related to furniture. I said no, we didn't get rid of them, nor should we. He's absolutely right. We have to change the culture.
Well, I'm grateful for that unexpected support from the Liberal Democrat benches, and he makes a very important specific point that supports the general argument that I'm making this afternoon. Second, Madam Deputy Speaker, on social housing. For decades after the Second World War, there was a national cross-party consensus about the value of social housing to help meet the housing needs and aspirations of many ordinary families. And there was a recognition that in this country, since the Second World War, there's only been 1 year in which we built more than 200,000 homes without the public sector doing at least a third of them. Yet this is also the first government since the Second World War that is providing no funding to help build new social rented housing. And this government has also ended all funding through the Homes and Community Agency programme for decent homes, which is the investment to bring social housing up to scratch. So if the First Secretary and the Prime Minister were serious about social housing, They would lift the cap on councils borrowing to build and maintain their homes, restore central government investment to help build new social housing, guarantee first dibs on new homes for local people, and strengthen the hand of councils to get better deals from big developers for their residents. Now, finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister wants us to contribute rather than just criticise. You have to ask, has she asked her cabinet to contribute? You know, what does the Secretary of State have to contribute to solving the country's housing crisis, to doing more on social housing, to reversing the plunging rate of home ownership in this country, especially for young people, to giving 11 million private renters basic consumer rights, or preventing the rapidly rising level of rough sleeping homelessness on our streets? Where's the plan? Where's the hope? Where's the leadership? And so I say, if the Prime Minister wants a domestic policy programme, if she wants to find common cause and make fundamental changes to government policy, then we stand ready to contribute, and we offer our Labour Housing Manifesto, published last month, as a starter. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, if the government wants our support for a plan to tackle the country's housing crisis, it must raise its sights. And if ministers want our support for their recovery programme post-Grenfell, then they must raise their game.
Sir Oliver Hill.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I start by saying that I do agree with the honourable gentleman for Wentworth and Dearne on one aspect, which is I think he's right to say that this was an accident which shouldn't have happened in a country like ours. And I do think that he's also right to argue for a national and clear approach that doesn't just concentrate on one issue but looks at all the issues involved. I thought he slightly uncharacteristically was not prepared to accept, or at least it seemed so, that over the years on both sides of the House when in government we've made mistakes in this area. And I think if he thought back to 2005 and 6 when the enforcement regime was weakened and the building regulations changed, I think he might just think, well, was that really tackling the problem on the issue of building houses? The previous Labour government had a deplorable record. So I don't think that he can just be holier than thou in this debate in the way that I thought he was tempted to do. But I would like to start, if I may, just by paying tribute to the local community for all it's done at the Westway Centre. And you know, people were generous, warm-hearted. They put their arms, really, around the victims' families. And I think our thoughts are correctly with the victims and families, but I'd like to just pay tribute to the communities of Latimer Road and the Westway, who I think come out of this very strongly indeed. I mean, it's time that fires which claim lives in high-rise buildings was a thing of the past. And just an experience from my own constituency. In February 2005, there was a fire in Stevenage at Harrow Court, a high-rise flat block, 17 stories. 2 firemen lost their lives, including my constituent, Jeff Warnham, and also a member of the public as well. And Jeff came from a family which is very much committed to public service. He was extremely brave in the fire and actually saved lives. And his loss was felt in my constituency and by his family, friends, and the fire service in Hertfordshire more widely. And this incident led to a fire investigation by Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue Service, which of course is a very good one. It's had a lot of experience of dealing with hazardous materials. It fought the Bunsfield fire as well as could have been done. And you know, I think it's generally a highly respected fire and rescue service. And they made recommendations, and one of them was that the UK Fire Service should explore options for high-rise buildings to have provision of sprinklers. And I felt at the time that this was an important matter, and we had a Westminster Hall debate about Hertfordshire firefighters' safety, and the then Fire Minister, Sadiq Khan, met Jeff's father, Robert Warnham, and fire safety experts to discuss the case for sprinklers to be retrofitted to all high-rise blocks, and experts in sprinklers went to the meeting too. Now, this hasn't happened, but Robert Warnham still feels that this is an important way of helping to ensure that there is fire safety in such blocks, and he contacted me recently to say he hoped that this could be back on the agenda. Now, after 2007, the rules were changed for new buildings over 30 metres high, which are required now to be fitted with sprinkler systems. Some local authorities have gone ahead and retrofitted to some of their blocks, as was mentioned by the Honourable Gentleman for Wentworth and Dearne. Coroners on 2 occasions have recommended retrofitting sprinklers, but it hasn't been the general rule, and I think we do need a national approach on this and something that is clear. Now, the British Automatic Fire Sprinkler Association estimates that the cost of fitting a system in Grenfell Tower would have been around £200,000. Now, we need to establish the truth of what happened in Grenfell Tower and make sure that it doesn't happen again. And I do hope that this issue of the retrofitting of sprinkler systems can be firmly and urgently considered, because I do think that it's something which may be long overdue. In terms of the investigations which have been ordered, I mean, there is a police investigation which will look at criminal wrongdoing, but I think it's good that a judicial public inquiry has been announced by the Prime Minister, and the 2 types of investigation have different purposes. Now, public inquiries investigate issues of serious public concern, scrutinising decisions and events, and the Inquiries Act of 2005 ensures that witnesses can be compelled and documents brought forward without any difficulties, and something which didn't happen in other forms of inquiry. But they are different to criminal investigations, but the parallel criminal investigation into the fire by the Metropolitan Police will be informed by the public inquiry, and if, for example, facts and recommendations are made in the public inquiry, if during the course of the investigation the inquiry comes across criminal activity, it will obviously pass that's its duty, to the police. There's been some discussion nationally about the choice of the chair, and I'd just say this, that people come to our country to have their legal issues resolved from all over the world, and they come here because we have independent-minded judges who don't mind telling the government where it gets off and when it's wrong. We have judges who are of the highest quality, and it's a transparent system which people trust, and that's why the English legal system's been copied all over the world, and why people respect it so highly. And you know, our common law system is excellent. And the choice of the chair for this public inquiry was a senior judge. Now, I think if you look at something like Hillsborough, where a senior judge presided, nobody would argue that these judges are not capable of dealing with a complex case and getting right to the heart of the issues. And so the Lord Chancellor asked the Lord Chief Justice for a recommendation of a judge who'd be best suited to the task of leading a public inquiry of this sort. And he recommended Sir Martin Moore-Bick. Now, Sir Martin is one of the most respected judges, extensive experience of trying complex cases, including the investigation of disasters. He was Vice President of the Civil Division of the Court of Appeal, so one of our very most senior judges, until he retired in December. Thorough, he'll get to the heart of the issues. And I think members in all parts of the House are determined that there will be justice for the victims of this tragedy and for their families. And I believe that the combination of a judge-led inquiry and a police investigation will achieve this. And I think you can judge how well a judge is going to run an inquiry by how speedily he gets on with the matter in hand. And in this case, I think Sir Martin has shown by immediately consulting, as he opened the consultation on the 5th of July, to establish the terms of reference, but seeking a wide range of views. I think that bodes very well for the inquiry. He wants to hear from those directly affected by the fire, but also those who have a contribution to make. And he's having a series of meetings to listen to the victims' families, survivors and others and take their views. I think it's welcome that the Chair has been so open to ideas and that he said he wants to establish the terms of reference as soon as possible so that the inquiry can begin the process of making sure we know what happened and how to stop it ever happening again. So I'm personally a strong supporter of a judge-led inquiry, and I hope it will be possible to have a relatively early interim report which will deal with some of these key issues like sprinkler systems and cladding, so that we do have that sort of national clear approach which the honourable gentleman opposite mentioned. And so I'm a strong supporter of the inquiry, but I would like to see sprinklers strongly on the agenda.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Scottish National Party welcomed the Government's announcement of a full public inquiry into this terrible tragedy, but we're very clear that, as others have already said, no stone needs to be left unturned in order to ascertain not just the immediate cause of this fire, but the wider causes of what happened and what went wrong, and to ensure appropriate lessons are learned and to get justice for those affected. Our thoughts and sympathies are very much with those who were affected by this terrible tragedy, and it goes without saying that we pay tribute to the bravery and professionalism of the first responders and the emergency services who dealt with the matter. I want to address, though, the scope and the nature of the inquiry. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm glad to say that the days when inquiries in the United Kingdom were establishment whitewashes are, I think, long over. I don't think our modern society could tolerate the sort of cover-up we saw in the now notorious Widgery Tribunal after the Bloody Sunday massacre, or the delay that occurred before the Hillsborough families found justice. However, we should always be mindful that the history of inquiries in this country has seen many examples of justice being delayed and justice being denied altogether. And it seems to me that this most often happens where those affected by death and disaster come from amongst the ranks of those who do not have wealth, power or influence in our society. And I'm thinking about the fleeing, unarmed Catholic civilians who were shot dead by the army on Bloody Sunday whilst protesting for their basic civil rights, and the innocent Liverpool football fans who were unlawfully killed at Hillsborough whilst going about their lawful business and then wrongfully blamed as being the cause of their own deaths for so many years. Now, these two incidents are very different from the Grenfell Tower inquiry, but I was very struck by the words of one Grenfell survivor, which were recently brought to my attention by the Scottish journalist and commentator Leslie Riddick. The man's name was Mahad Egal, and he told the BBC, and I quote, "We are not poor people, we are working class people, we are leaseholders, we are homeowners, we pay tax, we pay council tax, we make the economy turn while the rich put us into hazardous positions." And he went on to say, "I'm not going to hold back. We have been neglected from the get-go, and we are neglected still." Now, these words may be uncomfortable for some to hear, but they can't and should not be ignored, as they come from a survivor and someone who lived in the tower block. And I believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, that underlying this tragedy is the stark contrast in our society between those who have wealth, power and influence and those who don't. And what I mean by that is, it seems to me at least unthinkable that those with power, wealth and influence would have been condemned to live in accommodation which seems to have been such a death trap. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I say that this tragedy raises very real questions about the inequalities in our society and the inadequate provision of social housing in cities such as London. And there is a very real issue as to whether the inquiry is going to be of adequate scope, not just to address the immediate causes of the fire and its rapid spread, but also systemic issues underlying the tragedy. And so the terms of reference are vital, and it's vital that the participants have confidence in the chair, and it's vital that all participants have adequate funding to ensure representation and equality of arms. And I want to look at each of those issues in turn. Looking at the terms of reference, the Stephen Lawrence inquiry is often considered as an exemplar of what an inquiry should do. And it's worth remembering there that the terms of reference in that inquiry were simply matters arising from the death of Stephen Lawrence. Now, in this case, the survivors are concerned about some comments from the judge chosen to chair the inquiry, which suggested at an earlier stage that the inquiry will be restricted to issues relating how the fire started, rather than examining wider issues about the Grenfell Tower, the Council, central government and the management and funding of social housing. Now, I note that the Community Secretary told this House, I think last week, that the government expect the inquiry to be as broad and wide-ranging as possible, and the Minister has addressed today the way that there can be input into the framing of the terms of reference. But what's not clear to me is whether this House will be able to scrutinise or have any input into the final framing of those terms of reference. And in my view, a way should be found to enable this to happen. Because the Grenfell fire raises issues which concern all of the public across the UK and our constituents. And I've got constituents who've written to me who are concerned about the extent of the death toll, its composition, which seems to include the poor, immigrants, elderly people, disabled, undocumented, people who are sometimes forgotten in our society. And members of the public, such as my constituents who have written to me, are also concerned that the fact seems to be that a refurbishment budget for this block was spent with an emphasis on cladding that was pleasing to the eye rather than fire safe, and a suggestion that not enough was spent on fire safety measures. And the public are also concerned about the adequacy of the response to the fire. People have said, where was the publicly funded infrastructure dealing with relief? Where was the plan for the aftermath of this? So we need to make sure that the terms of reference of the inquiry encompass these matters, whilst also making sure that the interim report deals with the immediate fire safety issues. We should never forget, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the decades of failure to investigate properly what happened at Hillsborough began with the controversial decision by the coroner in the inquest to close off certain questions from proper investigation. So I believe we must be very careful here not to close off certain questions arising from how this fire came about from proper investigation. Now, turning to the chair, the problems with the child abuse inquiry show us it's vital to have a chair who commands the confidence of the victims. Now, as a lawyer, I'm not going to cast any aspersions on Sir Martin Moore-Bick's ability to chair the inquiry, but the concerns of the residents about his ability must be respected and listened to, because if there's doubt surrounding public confidence in his suitability, then that cannot be ignored, because it will undermine the efficacy of the inquiry. Now, as the Honourable Member for Kingston... Yes, I'll give way.
This is a judge who's dealt with the most complex matters, disasters. The Honourable Lady knows about this just as well as I do. Now, for somebody of that sort of ability who's been handpicked to do the job by the Lord Chief Justice, I mean, how can she say that that isn't the right sort of person to run a judicial inquiry? Exactly.
That is not a decision for me. What I am bringing to the House's attention, which is perfectly valid, is the concern of local people about the judge's ability to chair the inquiry. I was very careful to preface that. If the Honourable Gentleman just let me develop my point. The Honourable Member for Kingston Surbiton, who's no longer in his place, made the point that what's required here is a properly diverse expert panel to sit along the inquiry judge, alongside him, to advise on a variety of issues. And a local organisation, BME Lawyers for Grenfell, have made a number of demands which include that there should be such a properly diverse panel, and that it will advise on issues including housing need, fire and safety construction. Now, I respectfully suggest, if that suggestion is followed, doubts about the ability of the judge may be allayed. Well, whether the bench is opposite like it or not, it's absolutely vital that the people affected by this disaster have confidence in the ability of the constitution of the inquiry to bring about a just result. We do not need to look very far back in British history to see many examples where that has not happened and which shame us. Now, I'm going to continue to develop my point, and I'll give way in a moment. All I and others I'm asking, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that the Minister give serious consideration to the demand that, in addition to the judge, there should be an expert panel which is properly diverse and is of the proper expertise to advise on issues concerning housing need and fire and safety construction. Now, issues concerning housing need are not necessarily something that we lawyers are experts on. We maybe need a bit of assistance about that from somebody who is. That's the point I wish to make. I'll give way again, yes.
In our country, people, take cases against the government to our courts the whole time, and the judges are very keen to do the cases properly. They kick back the government on numerous occasions, as everybody in this House knows. Is she really saying that this is a judge, one of the most senior in our country, who isn't going to be able to do an independent, objective job of the highest quality?
Well, as has been said by my colleague from the Secretary position, that's not what I've said. What I have said, and of course this is not a litigation, this is a public inquiry. All I am saying is the government have already accepted that there requires to be a panel of advisers. The point I am making is actually quite a simple point, which that the panel of advisers should be of suitable expertise and diversity to inspire confidence. Now, another thing that's required to ensure justice is done is to make sure that not only victims but also tenants groups are given public funding for independent and separate legal representation, sufficient to enable them to have a voice equal to that of local and national government and the private management company. Now, this is a simple matter of human rights and equality of arms, and I was very pleased that when I asked the Prime Minister about this on the 22nd of June, she said that although the way in which the inquiry is conducted is ultimately a matter for the Chair, she said that for those who require legal representation, that will be funded by the government, and she wasn't going to set any limits in relation to the types of body or the individuals for whom funding would be available. And therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome what she said, because although the question of funding and proper representation is a matter for the inquiry, it can only work well within the constraints imposed on it by the Treasury. And if the tenants' groups aren't represented in this inquiry, then I fear justice will not seem to be done. Finally, I want to turn, before I say something briefly about the position of the devolved administrations, which the Minister alluded to, I want to turn briefly to the question of the recommendations of the inquiry being properly implemented. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would suggest that it's vital that this House is empowered to make sure that the recommendations are implemented promptly, because important recommendations are not always implemented promptly. We've already heard about the recommendations of after the Lacanau House fire. But after a tower block fire in Irvine in Scotland in 1999, just before devolution, a select committee of this House recommended that all cladding on high-rise dwellings should be non-combustible. Now, subsequent to devolution, that report was taken seriously by Scottish housing authorities, and building regulations in Scotland were duly amended in 2005. So all new high-rise domestic buildings in Scotland are fitted with non-combustible cladding or a cladding system that meets stringent fire tests. And since 2005, new high-rise domestic buildings are fitted with sprinklers. Now, the same recommendation was seen as optional south of the border, and it appears now that that has had tragic consequences. So it's vital, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this House finds a way to make sure that the inquiry's recommendations are properly implemented. Now, just briefly, yes.
I thank honourable friend for giving me a pay tribute, join the tributes that have been already paid to the victims and the first responders. There are many people in Scotland and indeed in my constituency who still live in tower blocks, and despite and as well as the reassurances that she's provided, they nevertheless will be looking to the recommendations that come from this report. Does she agree that there will be lessons to be learned across the UK, and it's important that assurances are provided not just to the kind of constituents that she mentioned earlier, but to people particularly who continue to live in tower blocks?
Yes, I entirely agree with my honourable friend. I've got many tower blocks in my constituency, and I was very pleased that the City of Edinburgh Council in a very early course had all elected representatives in to tell us what investigative steps that they were taking to make sure that these high-rise blocks were safe. Now, of course, as I've indicated, Scottish building standards are devolved, and the Scottish Government has already set up a ministerial working group to make sure that our buildings are up to scratch and to make sure that the Fire and Rescue Service are satisfied with the standards in all local buildings. And I'm pleased to say that all 32 Local authorities in Scotland have been able to confirm that none of the high-rise domestic properties that they own have used the type of cladding that we understand was used on Grenfell Tower. But the Scottish Government's not been complacent about this, and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service will continue to carry out additional operational assurance visits to high-rise buildings. And the Scottish Government is going to continue to monitor the situation in Scotland, gathering information from Scottish local authorities and taking a proactive and safety-first approach to this issue whilst we await for information from the investigation into this fire in London. But really the point I seek to make in my contribution today is that it is vital that the way in which this inquiry is set up, the framing of the terms of reference, the way in which the expert panel that's going to advise the chair is chosen, is made up, and the funding that's made available to all relevant participants, those things are vital for justice to be seen to be done, and we can't cut corners on any of them. There's widespread concern across the United Kingdom about the whole circumstances surrounding this fire, and the public and all of our constituents, but most particularly the people local to this fire, need to be satisfied that justice is both done and also seen to be done.
Sir David Amos.
The House struggles on occasions like this really to get the tone of a debate right. When members of this place awoke on the 14th of June, we would have all been horrified by what we witnessed, and how on earth those residents are coping with the tragedy, I just don't know. And I pay an immediate tribute to the local Member of Parliament, who hasn't been here for very long, but in no time at all has done her very best to support local residents. So congratulations to her, and I think the House will come together, at least on that point. There are no words, really, that are adequate to describe our feelings on this horror. It started on the 4th floor at 1 a.m. in the morning when most of the residents were asleep. And then within half an hour, a towering inferno took place. And to turn on the TV screens in the morning and see what happened, it was just truly shocking. And this was just a month ago. Now, this House has a huge responsibility, Madam Deputy Speaker, in this debate, how we deal with this matter. And I think the tone must be moderate. Recently, there was an article written by Nick Ross. Now, he's not someone I know personally, but he is someone who appears on TV as a commentator. And he said, "No one has a right to monopoly on anger or grief. For 15 years, I have been campaigning to update building regulations in England to improve fire safety and to have sprinklers fitted routinely to council and other social housing. And I can't recall a single government minister or opposition frontbencher, Labour, Conservative or Liberal Democrat, who ever campaigned with us. 3 times I've addressed the local government association, pointing out how the risks are disproportionate in subsidised housing. It's the poor what gets the flame, as 3 times they applauded and did absolutely nothing." Now I come to my honourable friend, the Minister. Ministers are mostly here today and gone tomorrow, but I hope my honourable friend will be around for a little time. And few would claim to be expert in their briefs, except for those who know it all, because they are gripped by rigid ideology. Most ministers, Madam Deputy Speaker, do listen to their advisers. So if there is any group whose actions allowed the catastrophe to happen, it was these advisers. And ministers took the advice. And finally, Mr. Ross says in his article, sprinklers are not invincible. They can't function if the water supply fails. But, and this is the truth that makes me so angry, no one ever dies from fire when a home is protected by automatic sprinklers. That's why in the United States they're installing 40 million a year. But let's not be persuaded that the risk is only in high-rise towers. There are 300 to 400 fire deaths a year, and most victims live in low-rise properties. We need sprinklers in all social housing, care homes and multi-occupation premises, including schools. And let's not forget our hospitals. There is a terrible anger after Grenfell. Instead of trading political insults, we must put it to good use. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, we politicians are often criticised. We take the blame for most things that happen. And we've been criticised for not acting as far as this particular issue is concerned. But that cannot be said of the all-party Parliamentary Fire Safety and Rescue Group. And I'm delighted that there are a number of members present in the House who are very active members of the group. Unfortunately, we lost 1 or 2 members in the last election, but it's been going for a very long time. Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't know whether colleagues are experts. We found out this morning that one newly elected a Scottish Conservative member was a former firefighter, and no doubt he will bring his own expertise. But most of us aren't experts, but we have depended since 1986 on 2 marvellous secretaries, first of all Douglas Smith, and then in 2013 Ronnie King took over. And time after time, as the honourable member who's the Vice Chairman of the group for Poplar and Canning Town said in an earlier intervention, we asked ministers to look at the Lacanau recommendation about the retrofitting of sprinklers, and we asked for the building regulations to be reviewed after 11 years. Now, my honourable friend, the Minister, who I think will be replying to the debate, has already met members of the group. And this morning it was agreed that I put a number of points to my honourable friend, the Minister, which I hope he will consider. Without prejudice to the public inquiry or the police criminal investigation, the all-party group wants to respond to the Secretary of State's invitation to submit measures which can be put in place immediately to keep people safe. So I entirely accept the frustration of opposition members that something needs to be done now, and we don't need to wait to the outcome of the public inquiry for that to happen. So I hope my honourable friend the Minister will reflect on that, because one such measure is to commence the long-promised review of approved document B to the building regulations forthwith, and in particular to seek an immediate reinstatement of the provisions of Section 20 of the London Building Acts insofar as they are required a 1-hour fire resistance to outside walls of blocks of flats. It's crazy that we no longer have those regulations, and the Minister will face the test. He will be given advice. Well, unless it's in the affirmative, I hope the Minister will make his own decision and will agree with the all-party parliamentary group's recommendation.
Would my honourable friend give way? Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend obviously understands these things better than me, but one thing that has really worried me about this tragedy, and I question it, is if there were sprinklers inside the building and the building went on fire outside it, would people have survived despite the fact that the building outside was aflamed? And that worries me. I don't know whether there's an answer, but it seems to me they might have done.
Well, my honourable friend makes an interesting point. All I would say is people do not lose their lives when sprinklers are fitted, and that's the point. The second thing that the committee...
On that point, I don't know. Does my honourable friend think that it just speaks volumes that in 2007 we said every new building should have a sprinkler system? Yeah.
Well, I'll come to my right honourable friend's point, but I also want the Minister to hear, because it's not his department, it's crazy that it isn't mandatory for all new school buildings to have sprinklers fitted. And this is something we've got to address as a matter of urgency. And again, I hope the Minister, if he doesn't get the advice which I certainly want him to be given, I hope that he will make a contrary decision and recommend that all new school buildings have sprinklers fitted. Now, the second thing we... Sir.
I'm very
him, and I'm grateful for his comments in regard to sprinkler systems in schools. But would he agree with me that it is also imperative that the regulations are changed to cover student accommodation? Because, as I understand it, tower blocks above 30 metres will now be fitted with sprinklers, but student accommodation over that height does not qualify for sprinklers, and that can't be right. Now, I hope my friend would agree with me on that point.
Well, I certainly do agree, and the Minister's heard what is said. As I understood, every building over 30 metres must have sprinklers fitted. So if the honourable member is right, and he was at our meeting this morning, I hope at some stage when the Minister winds up, a note will be passed to determine whether or not the honourable member is right. But as far as I understand, that can't be the situations. The second point the committee agreed, without prejudice to the public inquiry or the police criminal investigation, we want to support the recommendation of the coroners at Southwark and Southampton arising from the Lacanal House and Shirley Towers tower block, which the opposition spokesman mentioned, whereby both coroners recommended in a letter to the Secretary of State that the Department for Communities and Local Government encourages providers of housing in high-risk residential buildings containing multiple domestic premises to consider the retrofitting of sprinkler systems. So I hope my honourable friend will deal with that. And then in a letter to the then CLG Minister, which the committee wrote on the 1st of May 2014, we drew the Minister's attention to Ronnie King's personal involvement with the Lacanal House Coroner's Inquest, whereby clarification was given from the department that the current building regulations allowed the composite panels under the external wall windows sets of such tower blocks not to have any fire resistance. I mean, this is absolutely crazy. And that this weakness in the regulations remains uncorrected today, despite the upward spread of fire which occurred, resulting in the deaths of 6 people. Under the current building regulations guidance approved document B, the external walls of tower blocks need only have a classification O, surface spread of flame with no fire resistance. Now look, the House wouldn't expect the Minister to be an expert on all these matters, and he's got to take advice from somewhere, but I hope he understands the frustration of the All-Party Parliamentary Fire Safety Committee's recommendations being ignored, because this fire should never have happened. It should never have happened if notice had been taken of the recommendations that were made. Now, as I come to draw my remarks to a conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Home Office Minister, who is not in his place at the moment, said we may be looking at a system failure built up over many years, which we now have to address urgently. Over many years, and perhaps against a backdrop of, as data shows, a reduced risk in terms of fire, in terms of number of incidents and deaths, maybe as a system some complacency has crept in. Well, it certainly hasn't crept in as far as the All-Party Parliamentary Group is concerned. And I don't know anything about the judge who's been appointed to lead the inquiry, but he was certainly.
New member. I've heard that the Fire Brigade Union have talked a lot about the cuts to services and deregulation of the fire regulations, and I hear you talking a lot about sprinklers here. Would you agree with me that those cannot have failed to have an impact and they've actually happened on your watch? And I have to say further to that, I'm a bit disappointed actually about how many people are not on your benches for this debate. It's absolutely crucial and they should be here.
Yeah.
Well, as far as the Fire Brigade Union is concerned, I know the General Secretary, and I'm meeting him shortly to find out in further detail precisely what his criticisms are, and I can assure the honourable member that the All-Party Parliamentary Fire and Safety Group will raise any issues which the Fire Brigade Union mentions to us. As far as attendance on these benches are concerned, in time the Honourable Lady will have a view on attendance in this House. Going back a long time, all the benches were packed, and I can only say that I regret that on this occasion, given that the general public can see this on the parliamentary channel, it's always disappointing when the chamber isn't packed, but I'm afraid over recent years that has been the trend.
The honourable member. Refer the House to my entry in the Register of Interests, but on the issue of the Fire Brigades Union, would he agree with me that they should have core participant status in the inquiry?
Well, the Minister will have heard what the Honourable Lady has said. I can't believe there will not be very close involvement. I don't want to trip myself up if there's already been a discussion on the matter, but I certainly can't see why there can't be real participation in the inquiry. And perhaps the Minister, when he responds, will take that particular point up. So finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I say to my honourable friend, the Minister, the 3 points I really wish to highlight is that building regulations no longer include a requirement for 1 hour fire resistance for outside walls, as was required under the London Building Acts. Now that has got to be corrected. I think firefighters were horrified in the way this particular disaster took place. The second point is the testing of cladding. It costs £10,000 to fire test a 30-metre cladded wall. Most testing is done on the desktop, which doesn't take into account materials used underneath or between cladding, such as wood. I hope my honourable friend the Minister will look at that point. And finally, the retrofitting of sprinklers over the past year. In 100% of cases where sprinklers have activated, they have controlled or extinguished the fire. So I welcome the fact that there is to be a public inquiry, and I say again to my honourable friend the Minister, do please now not only listen to the recommendations of the all-party parliamentary group, but act on them.
Order. We have plenty of time for this debate, and there are a lot of people who wish to take part. I should also tell the House that I have notification of several new members who would like to make their maiden speeches. I would like to be able to manage without a formal time limit, especially for the benefit of people making their maiden speeches. It's much better not to have a time limit. We can manage this if people show some self-restraint and some thought for their fellow members and speak for around 9 minutes. That means, like, calculate 10 minutes and then stop a bit earlier. I know it's amazing how difficult people find arithmetic once they're on their feet. I will try to help them, but if we could just keep to around about 9 minutes, then everyone will have an opportunity to speak without a formal time limit. And I know that I can rely on Mr. Clive Betts to do this perfectly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is the most appalling tragedy, and I'm sure our hearts go out to everyone who lost their lives, their friends and their families, and everyone who has been traumatised by this appalling event and have now been displaced and are homeless. The only good that can come out of this is if we learn lessons about what happened, we learn them quickly, and make sure it never happens again. In terms of the practicalities of that, I want first of all address the issue of funding for putting right tower blocks up and down this country where there are deemed now to be failures and non-safe situations. I was worried by the First Secretary's conditions he put on the funding that might be available. He was challenged. Initially he said that of course the government would fund any necessary safety work that was deemed necessary by the local fire authority. He then withdrew from that statement and said the government would fund it where the local authority can't afford it. That's a very, very important condition. Will the Minister explain precisely what that means, what the criteria are which will lead to government funding, and where local authorities will be asked to find it themselves? And we have to see this, don't we, in the context of local authority finances as a whole. Not merely the cuts to local authority budgets, but this work to social housing will come not out of the general fund, but out of the housing revenue account. Funding for social housing was cut by more than any other expenditure in 2010. It was cut by 60%. There is not a penny of government money for either new social housing or for decent homes work or any remedial work in social housing in the current spending round. Local authorities have been asked to find it all themselves. Of course, yes.
Very grateful for giving way. But on that point, is it his understanding, therefore, that any works that are paid for at a local level will effectively be paid for by tenants out of their rents and by leaseholder contributions? And does he also agree that the basic repairs and maintenance budgets for local authority social housing have already been cut by 20% since 2010?
Absolutely, and that's precisely the point I was going to go on to, that coming out of the housing revenue account, the housing revenue account, of course, is funded from rents, and in 2015 budget, the government decided that rents would not rise by CPI plus 1%, would actually fall by 1% a year. It's estimated that that will have a massive effect of around many billions of pounds, around £40 billion over a 30-year period, in terms of less income coming into housing revenue accounts. Of course, housing revenue accounts can borrow money, councils can borrow money, but that borrowing is capped by the government as well. So the government caps the rents and the government caps borrowing. So where can local authorities go to find the money, in the Minister's terms, to show that they can afford to do this work? All they can do is to cut other planned expenditure on the maintenance of other social housing. Solving one problem will simply lead to other problems unless government is prepared to find the money. It's as simple as that. And I would hope the Minister would reflect very seriously on this, that local authorities shouldn't be having to come to show that they can either not build a few social houses that they were going to build and not going to cut back on maintenance programmes to prove they can afford to provide extra money to do necessary work on tower blocks. But the government will come forward and say that all necessary work approved by local fire authorities on tower blocks to make them safe will now be eligible for extra government money. It's a very simple request. The Minister can say yes to that and actually resolve an awful lot of concerns and difficulties in this debate. And it is a slightly wider context, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we simply got to start viewing social housing differently. There is a tendency in the last few years to see social housing as poor housing for poor people, and therefore anything will do for the people who live there. And I have to say to ministers, that is a bit reflected by the pay to stay scheme, which fortunately recently the government has now made voluntary for social housing landlords and isn't compulsory. In other words, those who can afford it, slightly better off tenants, shouldn't be in social housing. I disagree with that. Social housing is there for those who need it. And secondly, the proposal to have the sale of high-value council assets. In other words, if council housing is good and decent, it shouldn't be council housing any longer. That is wrong as well. Now, it seems to have been put on the back burner, this proposal, to fund the right to buy for housing association tenants. Again, the Minister can deal with that and say, in future, we are going to have good quality social housing and it's going to remain as social housing for those who need it. That's something else that government can do. I come on then to regulation, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Well, thank you.
I will.
He's making an extraordinarily good case. I hope the Minister does answer the points. It could add perhaps one more point to that, which is to say that where social housing is going to be used for tenants decanted. In the case of Grenfell, or indeed in other examples, other types of social affordable housing are going to be used, then that needs to be replaced as well, because otherwise we are again looking for a net loss in social housing.
I think my honourable friend makes an extremely powerful point. Not merely should government be funding the remedial work on tower blocks, but in the case of Grenfell, they should be funding the replacement of social housing as well, to make sure people don't lose out because of it. In terms of regulation, we need an immediate review of fire regulations. That's been called for. The Minister can announce that today and say government will get on with it. I hope who's ever elected chair of CLG Select Committee today, they will take a lead with the new members elected from that committee for the Select Committee to get involved, just as we have in the past on regulations around gas and electrical safety in the home. At times it was a bit like drawing teeth getting ministers to agree to new regulations. And I draw attention to the 2013 Select Committee hearing when Peter Holland, the new fire advisor, came to us. And he was questioned very strongly with the minister about making mandatory the retrofitting of sprinklers. And the minister then said no. And one of the reasons, and it was down in the Westminster Hall debate as well, was that you couldn't have a new regulation unless 2 old regulations were taken off the statute book. What a nonsensical position. Regulations are either necessary or they're not. If regulations are necessary to keep people safe, then they should be implemented without having to wait for 2 others to be cancelled. I hope ministers will rapidly act on this, and I'm pleased that my own authority in Sheffield has decided, in advance of any government statements, to retrofit sprinklers to all its tower blocks. Just coming on to the issue of the test for cladding, and other colleagues have made this point, it shouldn't just be the cladding that's tested in isolation. It has to be the insulation, the fire stops, the fire doors, and everything else about the fire safety systems in a tower block. Sheffield has only found 1 of its blocks so far where the cladding has failed. They've done that with the fire service. The fire service, however, has said that because of everything else in that block, they still believe the systems are safe for people to live there. It's a Hanover town block in the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for Sheffield Central. I think Sheffield Council's done very well. They've written with the fire authority to all the tenants, they've had meetings with them, they said anyone wants to move temporarily, they can do if they feel unsafe, they put a 24-hour fire watch in the block, but in the end, they believe it's safe, the fire authority believes it's safe because of the cladding working with the insulation, the fire stops and everything else. So ministers will now look, hopefully, at extending the tests and encouraging local authorities to extend the tests beyond cladding to the whole systems of fire prevention in blocks. And finally, Madam Speaker, with regard to Kensington and Chelsea, will the Minister explain to us why it's a task force and not commissioners? I said the other day, as a localist, commissioners should only be used in extremists. But this is an extreme example of a failure of governance. I will.
I'm grateful for the honourable member because this point hasn't been raised in the debate so far. After the Ariana Grande incident in Manchester, and I'm a Greater Manchester MP, there was a first-class civil contingency response. What does the honourable member think of the civil contingency response in this council after this incident?
I think the council itself and the government have admitted that the response was not adequate. They've spoken on that basis. But I just say to the Minister, why not commissioners? And the explanation that the task force will report to the Secretary of State, but they won't have executive powers. I'd just say to the Minister, this is a recipe for another disaster. When you have mixed lines of accountability and no one is sure who has executive power, that's exactly when things go wrong, because no one's sure who is responsible, everyone leaves it to everyone else, and when something happens, everyone blames everybody else. So please learn the lessons, and can we have an explanation about why commissioners have not been put in this case? It does seem to me the Minister could have acted quickly, and now we've got confusion rather than clarity.
Royston Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to assure the honourable gentleman that I'm following from Sheffield that if he does in fact win the Select Committee chairmanship by 1 vote, that will have been mine. You're very welcome to it. On a more serious note, Madam Deputy Speaker, before I begin, I would like to, if I may, declare an interest. As set out in the Register of Members' Interests, I'm an unremunerated director of 3S Fire Limited. 3S Fire is a wholly owned subsidiary of Hampshire Fire and Rescue Authority. It is a local authority trading company created
to help fill the gap left by the shrinking government grant for Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service. 3S Fire returns all of the profits to the Hampshire Fire and Rescue Authority, and all of the directors are unremunerated. Madam Deputy Speaker, on the 6th of April 2010, a fire broke out on the 9th floor of Shirley Towers in Southampton. I attended as chairman of the Hampshire Fire and Rescue Authority as crews battled to bring the fire under control. The fire was brought under control and 100 people were rescued on that night, but it came at a great cost. 2 firefighters who entered the tower block to rescue residents died after becoming tangled in falling electricity cables. They lost their lives while trying to save others. Those 2 firefighters, Alan Bannon and Jim Shears, demonstrated the very best of our emergency services, and they are still very much missed by everyone who knew them. Madam Speaker, the fire in Shirley Towers happened in 2010. The inquest concluded in 2012, and the coroner issued his letter in April 2013. In that letter, the coroner recommended, and I think we've said some of this, but I'll repeat it because I think it's important, that social housing providers should be encouraged to consider the retrofitting of sprinklers in all existing high-rise buildings in excess of 30 metres in height, particularly those identified by fire and rescue services as having complex designs that make firefighting more hazardous and or more difficult. After the coroner made his recommendations, Southampton City Council committed to retrofit sprinklers in 3 high-rise tower blocks. However, as the weeks and months passed, there was no move to actually carry out the work. I asked the Council over and over again and was always given assurances that a report was about to be written or funds were being made available, but nothing actually happened. Months and years passed, and then, finally, in February 2015, Southampton City Council approved a Cabinet report which said it would commit £1 million of housing revenue account money to retrofit 3 blocks: Shirley Towers, where the fire was, Sturminster House, and Albion Towers, which is in my Southampton Itching constituency. Madam Deputy Speaker, 2.5 years after agreeing the report and allocating the funds, those sprinklers are still not installed. Coincidentally, and the Labour Cabinet member with responsibility for housing in Southampton has assured me it's a coincidence, the sprinklers, which the city promised would be installed in some of the city's most vulnerable blocks over 2 years ago, will soon be fitted. Or at least, Madam Deputy Speaker, that's what I've been told. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition will be visiting Southampton on Saturday. I hope that while he is there, he will ask the Leader of the Labour-controlled Council, who was also the Labour candidate in the last general election, why he has not acted on the coroner's recommendations and carried out the retrofit of sprinklers in the city's high-rise flats. And I hope that on his visit, he will explain to the residents of those towers why he and his Shadow Chancellor have sought to politicise the tragedy of Grenfell Tower, but has remained silent when it comes to Labour-controlled Southampton's failure to act on the coroner's recommendations, despite promising those residents they would do so. Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am confident, or more likely I am hopeful, that Southampton will, 7 years after the Shirley Towers fire, retrofit sprinklers to our tower blocks. Madam Deputy Speaker, the reason for recounting these events is not for political point scoring in the way they may laugh, Madam Deputy Speaker, because that is what they have done from the day this tragic event took place. And I'm not doing this for political point scoring in the way that Labour have sought to do so. But I am doing it for a really important reason, Madam Deputy Speaker. When the inquiry into Grenfell tragedy has concluded, and we know what happened, how it happened, why it happened, the recommendations flowing from that inquiry must be accepted. The government, Madam Deputy Speaker, must act on those recommendations. They must not allow it to drift for year after year in the way it has been allowed to do in Southampton. In the years since Shirley Towers, there have been dozens of fires in Southampton's tower blocks. Dozens. If one of those had turned out like Grenfell or Shirley Towers, there would be no excuse and there would be nowhere for the local authority to hide. I will.
The Honourable might make a more convincing case if he didn't see it all from one particular vantage point. He says action after this public inquiry. Would you not agree that action should have been taken in the light of what happened at Lakenhall, and explain perhaps why government ministers did not make recommendations in relation to retrofitting and sprinklers after that, despite what the coroner said in his letter? No, you did not. No.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I understand it, and as I said, there was a recommendation that people should encourage the use of sprinklers. The difference with Southampton and with the local authority in Lakenhall is Southampton committed to do it, and Southampton did not do it. Therein lies the difference. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said, if one of those fires, in those dozens of fires that have happened in tower blocks since Shirley Towers in Southampton, had turned out like Grenfell or Shirley Towers, there would be nowhere to hide. If the government fails to act on the findings of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, then we will have nowhere to hide either, and the public, Madam Deputy Speaker, will never forgive us.
To make her maiden speech, Ellie Reeves.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you for this opportunity to address the House and make my maiden speech today. And as a London MP, I am grateful for the chance to speak in the debate about the tragedy of Grenfell Tower. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is an honour and a privilege to be elected to represent Lewisham West and Penge, the area that I love. I was raised and went to primary school in Sydenham, and I went to secondary school in Penge. I am now raising my own family there, and I'm proud to call it home. Growing up, if anyone had told me I would go on to become the Member of Parliament for my area, I would have laughed. Society never seemed to have much aspiration for girls from Cater Park School, and we were all too often written off. But I am here, and my sister, the Honourable Member for Leeds West, is here. So as my former English teacher said during the general election campaign, Cater Park now has almost as many alumni in this place as Eton. Our constituency is a collection of strong South East London communities around Forest Hill, Bellingham, Perry Vale and Sydenham within Lewisham. And since 2010, it has taken in the bustle of Penge High Street, the suburban calm of Clockhouse and the splendour of Crystal Palace Park, including its legendary dinosaurs. I am the 12th member to serve either Lewisham West and Penge or Lewisham West as it was before 2010. I feel privileged to be the first woman to represent it 99 years after it was created, the same year as the Representation of the People Act and the first election in which women could vote. My predecessor, Jim Dowd, represented the constituency for 25 years and has devoted more than 40 years of his life to public service, both in this House and on Lewisham Council. A lifelong resident of SE23, Jim stood up for our local services and good jobs, and he represented his constituents with conviction on national issues. He held a range of positions both in government and opposition, and effectively used his position to further causes that were important to him, especially his love of animals and their welfare. Even his general election literature from 2015 included a picture of him shaking hands with a giant cat. Previously a bellwether seat, Jim and those who helped run the local party have helped turn Lewisham West and Penge into a strong Labour seat, whilst never taking anything for granted. Yeah. It is in part thanks to them and their hard work that I am able to stand here now as their representative in Parliament. Jim has been a good friend to me and my family. His support has been immeasurable, and I know he will be greatly missed in this place. Yeah. Madam Deputy Speaker, the enormous loss of life at Grenfell Tower and the preventable tragedy of what happened there has cast a shadow over the first few weeks of this Parliament. Hearing stories of the events that night, it was hard to hold back tears. The unimaginable horror of a mother throwing a baby from a 10th floor window still haunts me. The inquiry must now happen quickly, transparently, and with the full inclusion of the victims. But what seems clear to me is that what happened there and in the aftermath is symptomatic of a system that is broken, a system that neglects the poor and vulnerable, a system where cost effectiveness seems to have been put before health and safety, and a system that I have come into this place to change. Madam Deputy Speaker, around the time Jim would have been making his maiden speech, I was at secondary school in the constituency. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, we had lessons in huts, class sizes of 35, and not enough books to go around. And as the daughter of 2 teachers, I knew that teachers were undervalued and underpaid. My parents are here today, and I am thankful for the values and for the support that they have given me. It was my experiences growing up that made me want to stand up and fight to end inequality and to make sure every child gets the best chance in life, no matter what their wealth or background. I am saddened to say that all schools in my constituency are facing funding cuts, and our wonderful boys' comprehensive Forest Hill School is £1.3 million in deficit. I made a promise to my constituents that I would fight hard for our schools and our young people, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Madam Deputy Speaker, another issue that I want to fight for in this place is defending workplace rights. Before entering Parliament, I was an employment rights lawyer for more than a decade, representing working people day in, day out. I know firsthand how many of our employment rights come from Europe, such as paid holiday, limits on working time, and many of our discrimination laws. I will fight tooth and nail to prevent any compromise of those rights as we negotiate Britain's exit from the European Union. But we need to go further than that and create a secure workplace and decent wages by banning 0 hours contracts and raising the national minimum wage. I was at a food bank in my constituency on Friday, and it is an absolute travesty that people are having to make a choice whether to feed their children or feed themselves. An issue close to my heart is maternity discrimination. After the birth of my son, I set up a business to provide pregnancy discrimination and flexible working advice to mums and families. I want to work to ensure that all jobs are flexible by default and that all parents can take parental leave without fear of discrimination or of the loss of their job. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe that a first-rate education, excellent healthcare, decent housing and proper employment rights are essential to the prosperity of us all. Rather than condemn our constituents to a race to the bottom, we must offer them hope and collectively